This is Voices for Climate, the podcast where activists, scientists, innovators, and everyday people speak up for the planet. If you're looking for honest conversations, bold ideas, and real climate solutions, you're in the right place. My name is Arnav, and today we are lucky to be joined by Ethan Lipman. Ethan is a solar PV and EV charging consultant who is focused on the deployment of electric vehicle charging hardware, solar power, and stationary energy storage systems. He provides his expertise to various Fortune 500 clients to navigate smart infrastructure investments. He has over 20 years of experience, having previously worked at Borrego Solar, EVgo, and ChargePoint. Welcome, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.
So, to start off, could you maybe share what originally drew you to work in the sustainable energy production space and specifically electric vehicle charging?
Yeah. I got a mechanical engineering degree at UC Davis, so that didn't hurt. Always had a connection to Silicon Valley tech, and energy and infrastructure is a big part of that. It didn't take long for my career to rotate from working in data centers, companies like Hewlett Packard. I was even in a sales role at Apple. I never got into an engineering space at Apple, but uh, these are companies that consume large amounts of power. It took some time for me to find my way down to Southern California, where I ended up trying to work on the high speed rail project for a time, and then shifted into a solar power role. The kind of my first break that got me into the solar power space was a company, Borrego Solar, that you mentioned, that hired me 2000, late 2005. By 2006, I was on a rooftop in Southern California, kind of cutting my teeth, getting some field labor, learned by doing, and then kind of found my way into leveraging my engineering degree in that space. But really, I can connect it back to school at UC Davis because, quite frankly, at that university there were a lot of folks that were focused on that. There were professors that were really connected in the renewable energy space. There's a professor named Andrew Frank who was, the pioneer of the plug-in hybrid concept, and it's fertile ground, I think, for getting involved in that stuff.
Yeah, that's cool. And so, I guess, given your extensive experience in the industry, I guess, how has your perspective on sort of electric vehicles kind of changed over time?
Oof. Um, well, it's always been there's always been uncertainty, right? So as you look at where it is and where it's going, and when I got into that space, I'd shifted, like I said earlier, from high speed rail to the solar power world, and then I shifted again in 2017 into ChargePoint. You know, I was optimistic in 2017, and I'm still optimistic, but you know, 2017 on forward was like version one of charging infrastructure. Let's call it charging infrastructure 1.0. Let's make an analogy to like the first iPhone, right? The first iPhone did some things, but it didn't do real time video teleconferencing between any point in the world. It was really just a thing that you could make some phone calls on and you could play some music on. So version 1.0 of charging was, let's just deploy charging infrastructure. Let's make it so that there's, that chicken and the egg problem. You have to have some level of charging infrastructure. You just can't charge cars. And I think that looking forward, it switches to not just deploying charging infrastructure, but maintaining it and having a standards based ecosystem where it's not just the Tesla connector for the Tesla cars and the CCS connector or J1772 for these other. We have to harmonize these standards. So the analogy I like to make in this space is, looking forward, it just has to get easier for the customer to know that when they're out and about charging a car, like most charging we think is just going to happen at home. Maybe it's 80%, but that assumes you own your home. If you're in a multifamily situation, it's different. So we have to be able to charge people where they are. And another thing that's worth mentioning to your question is that free is not a business model. A lot of people get really excited about free. The Gmail's free. Let me kind of turn it around and ask you a question. Should Gmail be free? Because those data centers aren't free.
Right.
So should charging your car be free?
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a good question that you pose. Yeah, and I mean, I guess,
It's got it.
maybe now sort of,
Oh, please.
shifting to the current day, what would you say is maybe one sort of bold sustainability move that the EV industry could make right now, but maybe won't because it's too risky or too like unprofitable?
Yeah. Yeah. So when you look at the charging infrastructure, I have this consulting firm called EVPV. That's
Hmm.
that's pairing two things that I know a lot about: solar and EV charging infrastructure. I say these are like peanut butter and jelly. They go hand in hand, but that's not easy to do because it takes time to deploy charging infrastructure. It takes time to get permits. So like the bold thing would be saying we're going to just have a canopy, a solar canopy at every single charging infrastructure to show that there's some amount of sunlight going into the car, show that we are doing a really good job of making sure that the people, when they're charging their car, they're protected from the elements. There's cameras, there's lighting. Easy to say, harder to do because all that costs money. But I think it would be a pretty bold move for folks to commit to, it's not just that you have to power this stuff with solar, but to really move the ball forward and live up to the hype or the sustainability goals of saying, hey, these electric cars are super super duper green. Where's the energy coming from? And some of my former employers have already made commitments like that. They're buying credits. You can. It's not playing games, but there's markets where maybe Tesla was saying, hey, we'll use this financial mechanism to buy some carbon offsets over here, and then they could sell them to somebody else. These type of financial arrangements happen. I think to really be more bold is to have some renewable energy resources on site, right? The more distributed energy resources you deploy, whether that's a fuel cell or a solar power installation and some batteries, you can. It's not easy to just power everything on site, but it could be faster in some situations than getting capacity from the existing grid, depending on how over saturated the grid is. There's not always capacity to serve a new load if you want to put charging infrastructure in location X.
Right. Yeah, and that makes sense. And so I guess, people generally consider like electric vehicles to be a good thing for the environment, but given sort of these questions you've posed about, where does the resources come from to actually develop this charging infrastructure or to get the energy, would you say there are any like common misconceptions about EV innovation that you've encountered, whether by like the general public or even among industry professionals?
Yeah, there's some misconceptions out there. You know, the electric car just by itself is pretty good. I
Right.
think most people should see an electric car as better than gas for a lot of reasons. The question is, what do you want? What are your goals? Because, if you want a car that is a really good daily driver and has a really good range and just can do anything you want, electric cars these days can do just about anything you want. But if you want that experience of being able to fill something up with gas in 2 to 5 minutes, that's not what a battery is. So some folks understand what a battery is from their cell phone. Like we're all accustomed to charging our laptops and our phones, and there's this history of, well, how fast can you charge it up? Do you charge it from 0 to 100%? Does it get hot? Like, we all know that when our device is super hot, it's not running at its best. Like there's useful analogies here, but I'd say the thing that folks are maybe the least aware of in this space is really what happens when you get rid of the car, right? What's going to happen with the battery? How sustainable is the supply chain that serves this whole ecosystem is dependent on a global supply chain. So I think a lot of folks in the United States are just starting to understand how far ahead China is at this point in terms of having surpassed the United States. We may have done a lot of innovation. Tesla's really been a leader early, but there are plenty of other companies around the world that are moving faster. And with the policies of China, they've really got some great cars over there that are cheaper, and some interesting questions being posed there that start to make some of these tariffs that we're seeing with our politics are kind of playing a role. So you have technology, you have business, and these things kind of run into each other in every industry.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess I kind of want to dive deeper into the supply chain aspect that you're talking about. As you mentioned, given like the ongoing trade war and things like tariffs, or the fact that China has sort of banned rare earth mineral exports, how do you think this might affect EV development and charging infrastructure development in the near future?
Like it presents a lot of unknown and a lot of opportunity. If you look at the United States, we have a history in the last, well, I won't do a whole history lesson here, but let's just look at Apple, right? I'm in Cupertino right now, and Apple Computer did a lot of manufacturing in China. And there's a recent book that was written that I think is worth reading. It's called Apple in China. And that innovation that happened in the United States in terms of, okay, everybody in Cupertino, maybe you could worship Steve Jobs or just acknowledge that he was a businessman that built an empire. That empire has been manufacturing a lot of products in China, and that supply chain is something that, if you read that book, you'll learn a lot about how much investment we made in China, really training up a certain amount. Now, I don't want to take anything away from what they're doing, but there's been a relationship there that has been maybe some design and some intellectual property in the United States, and some manufacturing and some supply chain prowess in China. And that's not just China. There's global supply chains that are, rare earths are coming from different geographies. So, the question is, how long does it take, and what appetite do we have to manufacture things domestically here in the United States? A lot of people are looking at AI and looking at how many jobs is this going to wipe out? People are prognosticating, but hard to really say what the future holds. I don't have a crystal ball, but one thing I do know, and I think a lot of us should have learned this from the pandemic, in a moment of chaos, if you don't make stuff, you have no stuff. Mm-hmm. So if you're dependent on getting your glasses from Luxottica or some company that's overseas, and you're not manufacturing that domestically, and they are no longer exporting that thing, then you better have the capability of making it yourself, or you get no batteries. So I think there's a certain amount of these trade deals and rare earths and minerals. Seems like it's, Mark Twain once said, there's, history doesn't exactly repeat itself. I'm going to mangle this, but it has a tendency to rhyme. So, there's been conflicts and material extraction as long as humans have been extracting materials, whether it's oil or lithium or cobalt. Mm-hmm. We're gonna have to get it from somewhere.
Mhm.
So I think it presents an opportunity for more domestic manufacturing, but it'll also take some time for the United States to train up enough people that kind of have those trade skills and build out that manufacturing base here because we've hollowed it out and exported it for a long time.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And you sort of mentioned AI, and I kind of wanted to talk about that side of things. So, in the EV space today, is there any use of AI right now, whether like using learning models to help with things like charging station placement? Is there any use of AI and machine learning in the space?
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of there are startup companies that are offering services in that space. So, as an example, you could think about a large language model that could handle a certain amount of questions. A lot of us are familiar with these chatbots, or whether you find them annoying or helpful. Uh, it's kind of an evolution, right? If you're outsourcing a question to a call center in, say, India, or pick your country, could be the Philippines, could be the United States. That's EVgo. When I worked there, they had a call center in the United States. Um, some of that I think is just going to go to large language models where, if you can have a quick chat and type on your phone and it can surface the answer faster than you can get somebody on the phone, that does have real value. When you talk about, the design and permitting and deployment of this stuff, there are, data is super powerful. If there's companies that are leveraging some of this new software to build out more efficient ways of surfacing information and permitting. And I'm sure you're right about placing charging infrastructure in the right location as well. But yeah, there's, understanding the grid and where there's capacity. And there's a project at Google called Tapestry that they famously have the moonshot program that hatched Waymo as well. So if you think about all these self-driving robo taxis, there's a lot of excitement about what Tesla's doing there and what Google's done, and don't leave out Amazon because Zoox is manufacturing in California. So they're in Foster City. So this is another. You can see these tech companies. They're not just doing computers, but I mean, what is a self-driving robotic taxi if not a computer and a battery? And they're moving a lot of data to those cars as well. And it seems like we're in another one of those races forward where it's how fast can you train up these AIs? Is Tesla's large AI model gonna accelerate them past Waymo, or Waymo seems to have the advantage right now, and that doesn't even scratch the surface of what's happening in other countries. Because if you think BYD and all these other auto majors in China aren't doing this, you're wrong. They have self-driving capabilities out there as well.
Right, right. And you mentioned things like Waymo, right? And we see Waymo in these big cities like San Francisco or Austin, but you're not even just Waymo, but EV charging infrastructure and just EVs broadly. What do you think is the biggest hurdle to widespread EV adoption right now, especially in like rural areas where we might not see as much of this technology?
Oh yeah, it's diffusion of technology from, first of all, you have to have power. And it's worth acknowledging that if you go back in history long enough, there was something called the Rural Electrification Project. And that was a big deal. Like, we spent a lot of money in this country, connecting up the whole country with railroads and the interstate highway system. These are really big, really expensive systems that, quite frankly, were built on the backs of immigrants. Famously, the railroads were built by Chinese immigrants, largely. Uh, this. I think one of the things that's happened regrettably in the United States is we're not building major infrastructure like we used to. Like the last really big project, like the Hoover Dam, maybe the nuclear power plant that it's called the Vogel power plant. It's closer on the, it was like a $40 billion project. So, there are some examples of large projects, but there's a couple problems. So you need a large amount of energy. You need power capacity on the grid to charge these vehicles. So, kind of going back to one of your earlier questions, a lot of people probably don't understand how much power is required to electrify all of our transportation. We've been using a lot of power to move people over the last 100 years. It just happens to have been, we think, dead dinosaurs. And I don't know that anybody disputes that, but I'm sure there's somebody that thinks it's something else. But I think our best science says it's fossil fuels. There's a lot of energy inside every ounce or gallon, and replacing that with electrons requires having a really robust electric grid, and our electric grid is aging. There's a term that some people use, the smart grid, but ask you a question: how smart is the grid right now, and how smart does it need to be? Because if you have a fault and some tree falls on a line, you need to be able to detect that and shut off that power before it does something bad. And we've seen some pretty bad stuff in Hawaii and California that where wasn't very smart.
Yeah.
So the utilities aren't, I'm not saying they're the biggest obstruction. They're a partner in this. The utilities want to serve these loads, but the amount of capital that's required and the investment, it presents an opportunity, quite frankly. You should, if you look at history, and there's an opportunity to employ a lot of people to improve the grid, to build out this infrastructure to support the demand. Everybody, if everybody's going to have an electric car, we're going to have to put a lot of power into those cars. And that's not just going to come from solar. It's going to come from all kinds of sources. If you're in some area like the Great Plains where there's a lot of wind, maybe a lot of that power comes from wind. Mm-hmm. So utility capacity, transmission lines, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess, you sort of mentioned these policies in the past, but there's not so much expansion that's, happening right now. And so what would you say that, governments can do and sort of policy actions that can be done, or even, actions by private companies to sort of better support EV infrastructure in rural areas?
It's actually, it's moving forward. One of the things that's worth acknowledging is, the efforts that have been made from government to fund this. There was a pretty big effort in the previous administration. There's a joint office in transportation. There's DOE, and they funded a lot of infrastructure build out, and that's totally appropriate. A lot of the money, a lot of the capital came from it's our public tax dollars funding some of the deployment, and quite frankly, we didn't deploy as fast and as far as some might have hoped. I can say with some embarrassment that some of the infrastructure that we've deployed is, it was expensive. I think that's that version 1. And as we move forward to version 2, meaning, some of the early first movers, might not always be the ones that stay for the long haul, or they also are evolving. There's companies that are coming and going, and you look at companies like Iona. They're really coming up right now, and they're deploying a lot of charging infrastructure. They're started in North Carolina. That's where they're headquartered, and there's been a lot of charging infrastructure players that have from overseas that have kind of planted their roots in places like Ohio and the Carolinas, where there's already a manufacturing base. There's already talented people that were in, call it the Rust Belt. There's Detroit was Motor City, and we have a history of some of those companies even pulling out, and there's opportunity to reemploy some of those folks in manufacturing charging infrastructure. So a lot of it's just happening. It's just might be happening slower than people might like in an age where we're accustomed to being able to push a button on a phone and just send a tweet. It's not as simple to push a button on a phone and poof, there's charging infrastructure. So construction's hard work, and a lot of this stuff, it takes time. So, and we're just quite frankly slower at it here, at least right now, than some other countries. It's easy to point to China just because they have an ability to move really fast and do big projects that just at a different scale.
Mhm. Yeah, and you kind of mentioned how the previous administration, had some policies and actions that were being implemented related to electric vehicles, but now we're seeing with the current administration some policies related to the climate are sort of being rolled back. And so one final question I have for you is that how can young people get involved in the climate space, whether it be by advocating for policies related to electric vehicles or even in the industry itself? What advice would you give to other people who are sort of looking to start out and kind of get to a level of impact that you have had?
Well, I was lucky to start by getting an internship. My early kind of Cupertino lore. Even Steve Jobs got an internship at Hewlett Packard. So did I. I was able to start my career with an internship, and I'd say anytime you can get in the game, there's I think the right attitude is there's nothing beneath you.
Hmm.
If you're at a company and you're just getting coffee for somebody, that's fine because you're getting exposed to it and you're building relationships. I've had ups and downs in my career, and startups that didn't start. Worked on them for some time, and company went bankrupt. Right, great idea. Sometimes you're the right place, at the right time. Sometimes you're at the wrong place at the wrong time. So
Hmm.
I encourage internship. I encourage folks to sink your teeth into something that you can do and that you're motivated to do. And even if you're not motivated to do it, honestly, I like Scott Galloway on this topic. He says things like develop some expertise and work at it. Like they call it work for a reason. You don't need to love your job, but good if you can tolerate it. But to be a little bit more positive, like surround yourself with good people and be curious. Just because something doesn't work out, just I think it's a good adage also to you get knocked down 5 times, stand up 6 times.
Hmm.
Sometimes you also need to just, if there's an obstruction in your way, you can choose how you want to spend your time. You could go around it and you say, this thing's in my way, nothing I can do. I'm going to let this obstruction defeat, or figure out a way to go up, over, or through it. Because just because another truism, at least I've found in my career, it's much easier to tear things down than it is to build things up. So with this new administration, they've torn down the loan guarantee office. It's an easy thing to criticize that the loan guarantee office made some bets and deployed a lot of capital, and the new administration also tore down USAID. I don't think that was a good decision, but is there waste, fraud, and abuse out there? Sure. In both private and public life, there's always going to be that in every single country on earth. But you know, whatever excites somebody, and even if it doesn't excite you, do it anyway and try things. I know some of the larger companies also have these rotation programs where, if you get into, a big company like, let's call it General Electric, General Motors, if you get in as an intern, sometimes they have these rotation programs where it gives you exposure to different things. I also encourage people to try the trades. There was a TV show years ago called Dirty Jobs by Mike Rowe. And if people are worried about AI, making it hard for them to get a job, there's plenty of jobs for people to build real things. Physical, real things need to be built, and they're not going to be built by AI. They're going to be built by people. That's electricians, that's plumbers, that's welders. And you look at like the CTO of Tesla. He started a company called Redwood Materials. They're in Reno, they're in San Francisco, and they're, to my earlier comment about the supply chain for batteries, that's a really big example of a company that's working on handling the batteries at end of life. So that also ties into a company called Crusoe, which is doing some pretty cool stuff on the data center side. They're not the only ones, by the way. There's another company called Moment Energy that's doing end of life energy storage. What do these batteries do? What are they useful for when the car's been driven for 20 years or 10 years or gotten in an accident? Do those batteries just go into a landfill? No, they should go to something like Redwood Materials or Moment Energy. And those are two companies that are definitely worth getting an internship at.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you so much for the advice. And that's all the questions I have for you. So thank you for, your insights into the EV industry and all the advice you gave us. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I hope to see everyone back for the next episode.